Hey everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Berklee Music Open House series. My name is Doug, and I'm a student advisor here. Today I have the privilege of being joined by Steve Morse and John Lennon to talk a little bit about some rock and roll. We're going to get started with like a 20 to 30 minute discussion with Steve and John, and we'll be taking questions throughout, so we'll get to some of those towards the end. And before we go any further, let me introduce our guests today. Steve Morse was a senior rock critic at the Boston Globe for 3 decades, and he continues to write for the paper on a freelance basis. During his tenure, he interviewed legends such as the Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen, Bob Marley, Stevie Wonder, Joni Mitchell, U2, Pearl Jam, and Radiohead. He's contributed to Billboard and Rolling Stone magazines and served on the nominating committee for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a 7-year term. And he also happens to be the author of our new rock history course. Now, John Lennon is a Boston native who has spent his entire radio and television career in the New England area. He's interviewed everyone from Aerosmith to ZZ Top. He's currently the music director for Boston's NPR music station, WUMB, where he gets to interview singer-songwriters on a weekly basis. He's also a part-time DJ at Boston's classic rock radio station, WZLX, and he also hosts several music documentaries for PBS television. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thanks.
Thanks.
So, Steve, this is Berklee's first online rock history course. What would you consider to be some of the highlights of the course?
It's been 2 years in the making, so I'm almost kind of, a blurry, punchy phase right now, but the highlights are probably the exclusive video content that we have. We collared Joe Perry of Aerosmith for about an hour and a half at his home. We talked to Bob Weir, the Grateful Dead. We reached Mike Mills of R.E.M., Ernie Isley of the Isley Brothers, quite a variety of people. Hugo Burnham of Gang of Four, telling us about the post-punk era. We have some young people, Amanda Palmer we talked to, and then I share some video memories. And there's a site developer at Berklee named John Scotty, who's a whiz at pulling off special kind of visuals, and I think people are going to really like what he's done. So I write the text, contribute some memories of at the Boston Globe I went out about 250 nights a year to catch music. Very blessed life doing that. So I basically, kind of distill it, share it, and I read about 15, 20 music histories to see what they had to say, and then just plucked from here and there. But I think the video content is really the special element of the course. It's Ernie Isley talking about watching the Ed Sullivan Show with Jimi Hendrix.
Wow.
Jimi Hendrix played with the Isley Brothers back in 63, 64 under the name of Jimmy James. A lot of people never knew that. And he stayed with the Isleys in New Jersey. So that's how they viewed the Ed Sullivan Show. And Jimmy said, I want to do that. That was the moment, where he decided I want to go into rock and roll, my own, be a solo act. So we have a lot of stuff, hopefully people will not have known before. The detail is unbelievable. That's all I can say. We're really well beneath the surface, and in 2 years' time, it's been an exciting project. It really is.
Now, you said you read 15 books. What was that one underlying subject that kept coming up out of that history?
It probably how everything leads to the next evolution. Mm-hmm. That's what really I've been amazed by. Back in the roots. How country music, hillbilly music, how jump blues, jazz, all led to the rockabilly era.
Mm-hmm.
in the Sun Records era. And then, the integration. We look at a lot of the cultural side of rock, how rock helped integrate audiences.
Right.
You know, back then, you know, Little Richard would play to, you know, African Americans and so forth, and then all of a sudden you had Alan Freed's reviews coming in, and Little Richard was playing with, you know, Carl Perkins on a show. But how everything kind of leads to the next phase, and then the Beatles coming out and naming themselves after insects, you know, which is what Buddy Holly and the Crickets did. And the Stones, you know, coming out and naming themselves for a Muddy Waters, you know, song, Rolling Stone Blues. So, and then that all evolved. So that's it. And then the psychedelic period, the progressive rock period, you know, where the culture was experimenting and got crazy. You know, the Who, you know, came out of nowhere, and that, of course, led to punk. You know, you could cite the Who as the real patriarchs of punk. So
and the Kinks.
It's been exciting.
And the Kinks. I mean, they're part of that tandem.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I think some people forget about rock is it took these English artists to embrace African American artists over here that we weren't privy to hearing on the radio. It took them to discover our music to make it over here.
Right.
You know, I mean, Chuck Berry wasn't played a lot. They made Elvis to be, you know, this soulful, you know, white gentleman from down south singing the hits of other people. But the Stones discovered all these blues artists. Led Zeppelin discovered all these blues artists, and you know, the same with the Beatles and Larry Williams and Chuck Berry, and how it just evolved into going back and experimenting and exploring those artists as well.
Yeah, I think I came across a statistic. The Beatles, I think, did 24 covers of American songs or something. It was a lot. So yeah, they were all you know, kind of ripping off American music in those days. But then, of course, I mean, you could argue that it all started from Africa. You know, and so we look at all of this, you know, in the course. But yeah, that golden age of the '60s, I don't think you can deny it when the you know, the Beatles and the Stones, and then, you know, Hendrix, and I was lucky enough to see a lot of those acts. I mean, I was still a kid then, and saw, you know, Zeppelin twice in England in '69. When they were on the middle act of a blues festival. The headliners were 10 years after, and Fleetwood Mac and John Mayall, and Zeppelin was just getting started. I saw, you know, Hendrix twice, Janis Joplin twice. I mean, that's probably why I don't have that many brain cells left, but enough, hopefully, to fill this course.
What was the first show you ever saw? I don't think I've ever asked you that.
Yeah, John and I have worked together in radio and different things as well. Stones, 1966, and there was a riot.
That was here in Lynn.
That was at Manning Bowl in Lynn, which has since been torn down. And they played for 20 minutes, and they were just on a tiny little stage, and there was no protection. You know, you think of a Stones stage today, it's like a fortress.
Right.
And nobody can get on it. But back in those days, women could easily climb on it, and they started attacking Brian Jones and Mick, and the cops just panicked and shot off some tear gas, and that was it. The Stones piled into a limo and left. And the funny part, years later, I talked to Keith Richards, and I said, Keith, do you remember that riot, you know, at the Manning Bowl? And he says, no, I can't say I do. That used to happen all the time in those days, so I can't remember that one.
I mean, you've seen, you know, the Stones progress and grow. I mean, you were at the Hyde Park show in '69 when they introduced Mick Taylor to the world on a bigger stage. What was that like? I mean, that whole free concert and the butterflies and...
I've been really lucky in my Stones, you know, history. I've been able to interview them a bunch of times as well. The '69 concert was about 400,000 people there. Wow. Absolutely huge. I think it was the first time they debuted Honky Tonk Woman. They had Sympathy for the Devil. They were doing that, and they asked people ahead of time to bring tin cans so they could bang them for percussion. So you had this kind of din of tin cans, you know, going off, you know, 400,000 people. It was a magical show because Brian Jones had just died, you know, that week, and in the swimming pool accident. And Mick Jagger let off all these butterflies, you know, in Brian's memory, and read a poem, you know, a very touching elegy that he read. But Mick Taylor filled in, phenomenally well, and the Hells Angels did the security.
Really?
And the British Angels were really benign,
Yeah.
And that's why the Stones, when they played Altamont 3 months later, where the Hells Angels killed somebody
Yep.
and wrecked the whole Woodstock dream in a way, the Stones hired the Angels thinking that, they're going to be like the British Angels. They didn't do their homework.
Right.
But that show in Hyde Park was, I was just so lucky to be there. I just happened to be in England that summer.
Do you think if the Beatles hadn't broken up, the Stones would have evolved into that band that they became in the 70s, since that monkey was off their back, or they were tired of living in that shadow?
Well, I mean, how do you mean? Evolved in...
In regards to the fact of, if the Beatles had stuck around,
Yeah.
would the Stones have moved up
Right.
a little bit?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, the Stones, there's something about Jagger and Richards. I mean, they're Lennon and McCartney kind of for life. I mean, they've had their ups and downs, but, you could just see they were, destined to be a career band, I thought. I mean, because they loved the blues. I mean, and they came out of that tradition where Muddy Waters bopped till he dropped, played into his 70s. And, today you think of rock and rollers sometimes as, quitting early or
Right.
Having a shorter shelf life because of the whole way the industry is set up. But, I mean, the idols of these guys were Bo Diddley. You played all your life. So, and the Stones kind of went off into their own thing anyway. I don't know if they didn't pay attention to people too much, except the disco era. They started doing some disco to be kind of chic. And
Everybody did. Everybody did. The Dead, the Kinks. I mean, they all touched upon disco, and that's another part of this course, the rock history. It's online, and it's going to be fantastic. It's the fact of everything evolves into something else. Rock and roll has always dipped its toe into other waters, and you look at the progression of how rock concerts have gone. From being corporately sponsored to
Right.
And the odd pairings of bands back in the day, like Van Halen's coming to town this weekend, and Kool and the Gang is opening up, and a lot of people are scratching their heads.
Right.
And last week when Davy Jones died, people forgot that Jimi Hendrix opened for the Monkees.
Right.
So
Right.
I mean, these odd pairings have never been really that odd.
Right.
It's just that they try to put a genre together, and I think that Kool and the Gang with Van Halen could be entertaining.
Yeah. I think it's sort of 70s and
Sure.
party music for both sides. But one feature of the course that has really impressed me is Berklee's gone out and partnered with Wolfgang's Vault.
Oh, wow.
The Bill Graham
Cool, yeah.
archives from the West Coast, promoter Bill Graham. So we have all this incredible content about bands playing at the Fillmore.
That's fantastic.
Fillmore West, Fillmore East, when they would, mix genres. You'd
Right.
see B.B. King playing with Janis Joplin. You just mixed everything.
Right.
And Bill Graham was really ahead of his time in that regard. So Wolfgang's Vault sent us like 100 clips.
Wow.
That we're sifting through, and it's really exciting. Like the Byrds on stage and at the Fillmore. Just these amazing kind of magic moments, and that's a feature of the course that's kind of growing and growing. And I'm curious to see what people are going to think of the way we mix it all together. The video content we have the this great concert footage, and we have promoter Don Law, who's kind of the East Coast Bill
Sure,
Graham.
yeah.
He was there since the beginning. He's got great stories about Keith Moon getting drunk at Boston Garden, and
What?
the show the show had to be canceled, and he had a beauty about Emerson, Lake and Palmer in the day. They wouldn't go on at the Garden unless they had a specific kind of bottled water. They had a clause in the rider, and it turns out the roadies drank all the water ahead of the concert, and Don was panicking. The manager came up and said, "These guys are not going on unless they have this water." And so Don fudged it. He got the empty bottles together, and he put Boston Garden tap water.
Wow. Wow.
In there, and he said, "Well, this is the best we can do, guys." And they said, "Okay, we like it. We'll go on." But it was Boston. They didn't tell him it was Boston Garden tap water.
And the historical thing about Don Law is his father really was at the beginning of what I guess would be rock and roll. His father, Don Sr., I think,
Yes.
recorded Robert Johnson. He's the guy that engineered those sessions, and
Yep.
without Robert Johnson, there's a lot of songs Led Zeppelin wouldn't have been able to steal.
Boy, that's for sure. Yeah. And he recorded them. Don Law Sr. was a producer for Columbia in Nashville, and he recorded, he did field recordings. And so he went out and did Robert Johnson in the San Antonio hotel room.
Right.
And Robert got arrested, the day before because the cops were messing with him. Those were the days when it was heavily racist, and incredible stories that Don Law Jr. has to share about that. But we really cover the whole waterfront. We
fantastic.
go up into the new millennium. We cover each decade with a lot of respect. And with a lot of irreverence, too. We go through the punk era. We got some pretty entertaining things. Hugo Burnham, of Gang of Four, he's from Leeds, England. He tells us about the Sex Pistols, saying the Sex Pistols. And, that's just an absolutely wild story there. So we have a lot of vignettes that I think people are going to enjoy.
Now, do you touch upon the growth of the benefit concerts? How, George Harrison started the concert for Bangladesh, which blossomed into this huge thing now,
right?
Live Aid,
yeah.
On both ends of the world, if you will, or both sides of the pond. Some people forget about the fact that George Harrison, again, it goes back to the Beatles, that he started, the charity concerts.
Yes, that's been kind of a something I've been very interested in, the whole sort of socially conscious side of rock and roll, whether it's George Harrison or U2 or I was at Live Aid. I've made it a point, in my career to go to these events. I was at the first Farm Aid, the Amnesty International concerts. I really find it to be really inspiring what rock and roll has done through the years. I mean, that Live Aid, they made $54 million for famine relief in Ethiopia. And that was, then. I mean, it'd be worth much more now.
And plus, Live Aid really put U2 on a global map.
Right.
That performance was the one that just solidified where they were going.
Right. Yeah, U2 is a particular favorite of mine. I saw them at the club level and kind of grew up with U2. And they were not a good club band, believe it or not. I mean, Bono refers to them as a lousy club band.
Right.
You can't even imagine. You think, gee, U2, I mean, they play stadiums, they play wherever they want, but you'd think I would die to see them in the clubs, but they were kind of an awkward club band. They weren't that great back then.
And a lot of people forget about the fact that it is the Larry Mullen Jr. band. and he never liked Bono as the singer. He wanted to get rid of him early on.
Right, he was the leader at one time.
And I remember seing U2 down in Providence. It was Larry's 40th birthday, and he said he waited 20 some odd years to be in front of the band. But this online rock history course here at Berklee, it sounds interesting in regards to the fact that you can cover so many aspects of it, and how rap comes into it. I mean, the Beastie Boys sampling all of Led Zeppelin. The Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique would never be made now because it would be so expensive due to sampling.
Right.
They sampled the Beatles, the Eagles, more Led Zeppelin. The fact that Run DMC discovered this band Toys in the Attic, not realizing it was Aerosmith, and that reignited Aerosmith's career. So, I mean,
we have a great interview with George Clinton of P-Funk, where he talks about funk being the DNA of hip-hop, which
sure.
I love that line. And he's been sampled, I mean, of course, for years. And he was very gracious to come in, and he talked about Funkadelic. I never, that's a combination of funk and psychedelia.
Right.
And I never realized he's a huge Pink Floyd fan.
Really?
Yeah, and remember they had a spaceship on stage, and giant birds and all these weird props. He kind of adapted that from Pink Floyd, and also George Clinton was inspired by Detroit bands, Iggy and the Stooges. The MC5, they got that harder edge
Yeah.
that came into their funk sound. So this is it. We're looking at all of how things kind of connect, how they evolve, and that's kind of a connect the dots, but in a hopefully a really refreshing, different way.
Do you get into that whole New York sound, Boston sound, Detroit sound, San Francisco?
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah. And we look at Memphis, Stax Volt, that whole era, and the soul era. We hit Motown pretty hard. George Clinton was a staff writer at Motown years ago, and so we have people, who were there, talking about it. But yeah, the San Francisco, the psychedelic era, Bob Weir talking about Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, and also the acid tests. The LSD was legal back then when they were first doing the acid tests. So he's got some things to share about that, and what it's like to jam with Jerry.
Sure.
and how he approached that, and how he always wanted Jerry to have an element of surprise, when Jerry'd be soloing, and then Bob would come in with some little different rhythmic figure, to spice it up.
Well,
we cover all the cities, yeah.
And that's one of the things a lot of people don't realize how good the Grateful Dead are or were. I had the chance to talk to I think he's a Berklee alum, Bruce Hornsby, when he was in the Dead, and they would always try to make him. They would always try to make him screw up, and he was able to catch up. And Bob Weir told me in an interview that they did it on purpose, and they thought what a great musician he was. And then I got to see Bruce after that, and Bruce said that they made him a better musician.
Right. Yeah.
And those shows that he did, I mean, they were phenomenal, and it was great to see him, and he lived, which doesn't happen with keyboardists in the Dead.
I know. 3 have checked out, right? Yeah. Hornsby even used to call it the death chair.
Yeah.
The keyboard chair. But yeah, no, that Hornsby I've gotten to know a little bit too, and yeah, he was incredible with the Grateful Dead. I agree with you. Even when Jerry was kind of fading a little bit, Bruce kind of came in and propped them up. But I originally saw the Dead at the club level when Pigpen fell off the stage. Pigpen was doing Love Light.
Wow.
And he might have had a little bit too much to drink, perhaps.
No.
And he just went plop right off the stage, and the roadies dusted him off, and the band kept playing. They just kind of looked over, and I guess they said, "Hey, Penn fell off the stage again," and they waited for him to get up and finish Love Light.
That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. Security'd be on it in a minute.
Well, it looks like we actually have some questions coming in.
Cool.
If you guys don't mind taking a few.
Sure.
So the first one here, I want to know how you guys see the future of rock compared to where it kind of originated, and what kind of direction and major influences you see cropping up today.
Where I work now at WUMB, I'm seeing a lot of singer-songwriters, and they respect Bob Dylan, they respect Ramblin' Jack Elliott, they respect Pete Seeger, and a lot of that stuff is still there. Social networking obviously is going to be a very huge part of the future of music and getting the word out there. But I just see a lot of that coming back. It's easier for someone to make a record now in their own home, thanks to computers. So, the big studios that we used to have might go by the wayside. I'm not saying they will, but the possibility's there, So I think that it goes back to the roots of just 6 strings, a piece of wood, and sing, and use your talent, utilize your talent that way.
Yeah, I think, rock and roll, it goes in cycles. I mean, it's like the blues used to be. I mean, there'd be ups, there'd be downs, but overall, rock has often been an outsider's music, and in the 50s,
Sure.
It was very much, it was the devil's music when it started or whatever. And now, of course, you have hip hop, dominating quite a bit. But I think, rock is going to, rebound. I think the tough part is the bands to stay together, because there's not a lot of career development. I mean, the labels are kind of gone, and they used to give 4-album deals, like R.E.M. They didn't have a hit till their 4th album.
Right.
And Warner Brothers stuck with them. Today you'd get, you know what I mean, a small deal, and if it doesn't sell, you're out. So that's a problem. A lot of people get discouraged. and their girlfriends say, "Hey, look, go to grad school, forget about this. This is a hobby." It's tough to look at it as a career. You have to be. It's almost like a calling today. You have to be driven to do it. But I'm encouraged that there's, Kings of Leon. I mean, there's some good bands out there that, Wilco. I mean, there's bands. Pearl Jam's one of my favorites. That are becoming career bands.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge Wilco fan, and one of my favorite stories is all about Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. Sure. And how they brought that to the label, and they said, "This is awful. This isn't going to sell."
Right.
And they let them keep the masters, so they took it and started shopping it around, and an even smaller subsidiary ended up buying it from them, Nonesuch, which was a smaller subsidiary of Warner Music. So Warner paid for that album twice, and to this day, it's generally considered their most critically acclaimed, big career-changing record.
What else you got?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So this is coming from somebody who is actually studying music production with us right now, and they're considering doing the rock history course as the last elective in their certificate, and they're curious to know how this course might benefit or kind of help them develop as a producer.
Good question. One of the interviews I haven't mentioned yet is with Jack Douglas.
Yep.
The producer who best known probably with Aerosmith. Did the classic Aerosmith records from the 70s. He's a real rock and roll producer. And then he did John Lennon. And he shares stories about being John Lennon's getaway driver, back in the Lost Weekend days when Lennon was in L.A. in the 70s and would get in, near fights at some of the bars, and, Jack would have to, pull him out of there. And Jack also did Patti Smith, New York Dolls, Alice Cooper. So we have him talking about how production has changed and evolved. There is a technological component in each lesson. There are 12 lessons, and we cover technology, how studios developed through the years, how the Beatles were so influential with the, all their distortions and feedbacks and all the things that George Martin was doing. So it's a component of the course. Hopefully, there'll be enough for someone who's really looking to specialize in it. But we've got business highlights. We've got each era. We're really looking at from technology to business to. We cover managers. We look at Brian Epstein of the Beatles, Andrew Loog Oldham of the Stones. How their techniques. Colonel Parker with Elvis. So there's a little bit of something for everyone, I think. It's quite an overview.
Here's an interesting one. Do you think that the guitar is always going to be that defining instrument that kind of stands out in rock and roll?
I say yes because of Robert Johnson. I mean, he played guitar, and that's all he had. It was his voice and a guitar. And it went through everybody. I mean, Chuck Berry, guitar. That inspired Keith Richards. Isley Brothers, guitars. That inspired the Beatles and their harmonies. The guitar is, I mean, the most basic one obviously is drums, but the guitar has been the one thing that has always gotten the chicks, and it's easy to carry. So,
chicks. But we don't talk about that too much in the course. But now that you mention, but
it's always the Beatles set that precedent of two guitars, a bassist, and a drummer. That's the formulation of a band. I mean, Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Don't get me wrong, but every band has that 4 elements. But the guitar is vitally important. Sure.
We have a whole thing on the synth pop revolution too, back in the 80s, where the synthesizer became inexpensive and people were able to afford it quite easily. And Keith Richards, boy, he was angry during that era. Sure. He didn't like synth pop, so he was happy when that kind of peaked. But I'd like to think that rock and roll is not just guitar. I mean, I think it's the hip hop influence, the beats, and it's an attitude. I think is what we're looking at too. It's kind of a rebellious attitude, if you're willing to stick your neck out, if you're willing to be creative, cut across the grain of the culture at the time, then that's rock and roll. I mean, to me, I prefer guitar rock. I mean, I'm kind of a little bit, of a purist in that way, but I think you've got to keep an open mind, especially today when there's so many, electronic inventions coming along every minute.
So one last question before we wrap up, and this might be a tough one. But if you could narrow it down to maybe one, or if you have to, 3 concerts, I'm sure you've both been to many. Is there one show that really sticks out that it was like, yes, that's the show?
I know what my number 1 show of all time is, but I'll admit to this on camera. The first time I saw Bruce Springsteen,
Really?
I saw him in '99. I never got to see him earlier, and we were 4 songs in, and I teared up a little bit. And I remember my boss's wife was saying, "You okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And then afterwards we talked, and I said, "Bruce played for 3 hours, and put on a show that every teenage boy has put on in their bedroom, and he just knocked it out of the park." And it was just, and I didn't tell that story to anybody, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, I heard you saw Bruce." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you make you cry?" And I said, "How do you know?" And she goes, "I hate him and he made me cry." That speaks volumes. I mean, that's just unbelievable.
That's begrudging praise.
But I mean, I've never seen an artist have an audience right in the palm of his hand without saying a word. It's just the emotions, it's the fact that he put on a 3-hour show and just rocked it. Steve has probably seen far better shows than what I've seen, but we've had some shared experience as well.
I've seen some great Bruce shows, no question, but probably for me, the best live band I ever saw was Zeppelin. And I saw them in 1969, as I've mentioned earlier, twice, and the second time was at Royal Albert Hall. And that's probably the single best show that I've seen, with Jimmy playing the double neck guitar and, Robert Plant just wailing at the top of his lungs. And I tell people there's a Live at the BBC record from that same week that they played Royal Albert Hall and this festival I went to see them. And I hear that record and I have like flashbacks. They were so phenomenal then. Hendrix is the best individual I ever saw in concert. Zeppelin's the best band, and then you got to put up in the pantheon U2, Springsteen. Sure. Pretenders were great live. Remember Chrissie Hynde? They were incredible.
I never saw her with the original band. I saw her later
I
on.
saw with the original band. Yeah,
but there's something about U2 playing here in Boston, or New York or Chicago, anywhere there's a big Irish, en masse. But I had a friend fly out from Hawaii to see them here, and we got to meet them at Steve's retirement party. So
I mean,
was worth it.
Their first show in the States. I mean, wasn't that over at Paradise Rock Club?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was
opened for a band called Baraga Bandit.
Right.
That's worth some money in a bar.
I've seen people win bets for that. They were Baraga Bandit was managed by Bob Seger's road manager. So that's if you want to really get trivia. Yeah, but Live Aid was probably the most important show that I saw. That was like a 13-hour show. Mm-hmm. It featured a Led Zeppelin reunion. Remember Phil Collins came over on the Concorde from the Live Aid show in London.
And ruined Led Zeppelin's set.
And oh, you're tough. You're tough. He's a good drummer. I might not like him as a singer, but Phil Collins was a good drummer. And that's where, Mick Jagger, Tina Turner did their, everybody played that. Madonna, the Cars, Duran Duran, everybody played that Live Aid during the Eric Clapton. So Keith Richards, and Ronnie Wood did that kind of ill-fated, moment together with Dylan, right?
Mm-hmm.
They did. But that's the impact of that show was something else.
And I think the concert for New York City is also one of my favorites, to see all those great artists in one venue. And
did you go to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there too.
And the fact that it was put together by Paul McCartney, where New York was so important, and you really wish that John were still alive, because he definitely would have done something at that point. And there had been rumors flying around that maybe this would have been the last time to see the Beatles. George was very, very sick and in the hospital, but Ringo was here in Boston, and a friend of mine had seen him, and there was rumors. But to see the Who do what they did that night. I mean, that really solidified them as the highlight. And to have Mick and Keith come out after and bring, you know, like the Who were the peak, and the Stones were bringing us back down to earth. And I remember interviewing Mick, and I said, you know, if it wasn't, you know, no one could have followed the Who except you guys. And it was just an amazing show.
Yeah, the Who did "Won't Get Fooled Again,"
right?
And that was in New York. That crowd was angry.
Oh yeah.
You know, after 9/11, and when the Who went into "Won't Get Fooled Again," everybody just erupted. You know, I mean, it was just an emotional high, wasn't it? I mean,
you know, and it was just one of those amazing things that you're glad to say you were a part of. You know, because it was so many different people to come together for us, and you realize that these artists owe a lot to America. You know, never mind just New York. But I mean, it was great for them to do that, and that was an awesome.
I was
awesome
so
show.
wired up from that show that I drove all the way back to Boston that night. It's like a 4-hour drive, and I said, I can't go to sleep. I mean, forget it. And I just got in my car, and I was alone, and just there I was.
Well, thank you so much to both you, Steve, John, for being here today.
Thank you.
This was a lot of fun.